WNYC Studios.
At his confirmation hearings this week, Supreme Court nominee Neil Gorsuch began his opening address with some biographical details.
My grandmother grew up on a Nebraska farm where an ice box wasn't something you plugged into the wall, but something you lowered into the ground. With 7 children, she never stopped moving, and she never stopped loving.
As the New York Times put it, Gorsuch, quote, cast himself as a humble Westerner reared on fly fishing. And yet, for all the care put into his biography, Judge Gorsuch also seems to say, never mind, he rules on the law, not on people.
My decisions have never reflected a judgment about the people before me, only a judgment about the law and the facts at issue in each particular case.
It's a needle that's been tricky for judicial nominees to thread. They want to seem human, but not too human. In a show we called Bench Press, which aired last year, Brooke examined what it means to really know a justice.
For all the drama associated with the court, flowing robes, lifetime appointments, nation-changing rulings, cinematic depictions of the justices are rare. Here's a sampling. First Monday in October, released in 1981 around the time of Sandra Day O'Connor's appointment, parodied the notion of a lady justice.
Jeff, why in God's name do I get a sinking feeling in my gut every time I think about that woman sitting on this court? It's not because she's a woman. I like women. My wife's a woman. The bench will smell better with a little perfume on it. But Ruth Loomis.
That film was a flop. Then there's The Pelican Brief, the thriller based on John Grisham's novel in which 2 Supreme Court justices are mysteriously murdered.
Now, what's so important?
This is a brief written by an eager beaver Tulane law student. It's a theory on who's behind the assassinations. And indirectly, it implicates the White House.
Steven Spielberg's Amistad tells the story of a shipboard slave mutiny in 1839, the mutineers jailing by the U.S. government, and the Supreme Court case that ultimately freed them. In the film, Justice Joseph Story is played by a real former Supreme Court Justice, Harry Blackmun.
Over 1%. It is the court's judgment that the defendants are to be released from custody at once, and if they so choose, to be returned to their homes in Africa.
But none of these films ever depict the court at its real work, the nitty-gritty behind the decisions that reverberate through our lives. Maybe it's because much of the court's work, reading cases and writing briefs, is inherently undramatic. Thane Rosenbaum, director of the Forum on Law, Culture, and Society at the New York University School of Law, suggests it's also because the court's work is inherently incompatible with art.
The world of the Supreme Court is a world of narrowing, and art is about expanding the canvas to give more sense of drama of the human experience, the emotional complexity of human beings. And that's really not the business of the court. By the time you get to the Supreme Court, you're arguing points of law. And so the whole experience has a kind of suffocating feeling, and it doesn't have the kind of grandeur of life and the openness of life.
But the impact is so important sometimes, so utterly nation-changing.
That's true. Everyone is obsessed with either same-sex marriage or gun control laws, the Affordable Care Act, Citizens United, the relationship between national security and civil liberties. These 5 or 6 areas of the law so profoundly affect and influence the person on the street that it forced them to think for the first time that the Supreme Court was important.
Okay, so we're in an interesting moment right now because there does seem to be a spike in depictions of the Supreme Court in the culture. A number of movies and plays have been produced or they're in the works. What stands out for you?
There's the new biopic that Natalie Portman will be starring in which she portrays Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Title of that, I think, is On the Basis of Sex. Really, that's about Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the young lawyer who graduates first in her class at Columbia and can't get a clerkship, and how she then dedicates her entire life to gender and sexual equality. It'll be about the life that led to her becoming a justice. We have a film that HBO is working on called Confirmation, in which Anita Hill testified against the confirmation of Clarence Thomas, the scandal that erupted in her claims of sexual assault and his denials. That was a very dramatic moment.
But it had very little to do with what the Supreme Court does.
I would be very surprised if they spent 5 seconds in this HBO movie showing you Clarence Thomas in an actual robe.
Well, what about on stage? There's a play called The Originalist, and I guess it imagines a relationship between Justice Antonin Scalia and a liberal law clerk.
Who happens to also be gay. And so you have this probably highly unlikely scenario that Scalia would have hired a female gay pro-same-sex marriage liberal. It's a very lovely play because he develops a kind of fatherly affection for this young law clerk, even though they can't agree on anything. But again, my understanding of that play, Brooke, is that you don't see Justice Scalia on the bench. You see him arguing with his clerks.
That gets you closer, though. That's part of the process, which is more than you can say for Scalia Ginsburg, the operetta.
Yes, but that picks up on the idea that it's possible that two justices that can't agree on anything when it comes to interpreting the Constitution love having dinners together and love going to the opera together.
Let's listen to a little bit of that.
We are different. We are one. The U.S. contradiction. The tension we adore. Separate strands unite in friction to protect our country's core.
Have you seen this?
No, I have not, but I enjoyed that immensely.
Obviously, the focus is on the justices themselves as characters. What do you think's driving that?
I think the appointment of Sonia Sotomayor has really been a game changer in our expectations of what we want out of Supreme Court justices. President Obama is really responsible for this because when he introduced Sotomayor to the country, he said that she had a compelling life story.
As impressive and meaningful as Judge Sotomayor's sterling credentials in the law is her own extraordinary journey. Born in the South Bronx, she was raised in a housing
And the
project.
Republicans on the Senate Judiciary Committee went nuts. Judges were supposed to be robed robots, mechanical in their application of law. No one had ever introduced a justice and actually said that their life experiences is what would make this person a really great Supreme Court justice. I think it had a lot to do with changing mindsets about, well, should we know these people? You know, if they have such an impact on our lives, who they are might have as much to do with their rulings as their ideological principles.
You know, weirdly, a preview of this came from by far the quietest justice in a case called Virginia v. Black.
Quite right. Clarence Thomas famously never speaks during oral argument. And here you have a cross-burning case, and before the first appellant even got a word out, Clarence Thomas jumps into the fray. And he talks about what cross-burning meant to African Americans and how threatening it was and how wounding it was.
We had almost 100 years of lynching and activity in the South by the Knights of Camellia and the Ku Klux Klan. And this was a reign of terror, and the cross was a symbol of that reign of terror. Isn't that significantly greater than intimidation or a threat?
Up until then, all the First Amendment cases permitted cross-burning as a First Amendment right. And this was the one case that actually said, well, you know, in situations in which it could be threatening, there could be some restrictions that local governments can impose. And it had a lot to do with, I think, the discomfort that the court felt that the one African American on the court stepped out of his robe and said, here I am, I'm a black man. But again, law professors, judges, Republicans frown on justices representing their personal interest, that it's really there about judicial temperament. And judicial temperament means that you're emotionally neutral.
William Rehnquist, a former Chief Justice, would certainly stand with those you should say are dispassionate, and yet had his moments of personal intrusion for which he was excoriated.
This had to do with oral argument in a case dealing with the Family Paid Leave Act that applied to public government employees, which essentially gives paid leave to women who have children. I think it even might have applied to men. In this case, dealt with, should we extend that law to private companies? Rehnquist shocked everyone and ruled in favor of extending the benefits to private corporations. He would never be in favor of more government intrusion that extended benefits. But what we didn't know, wasn't widely reported, is that his daughter was going through a nasty divorce, and she needed help in picking up the two daughters. And all of a sudden, Justice Rehnquist was Grandpa Rehnquist, and he was asked by his daughter a couple days a week to leave the Supreme Court building to get to school by 3 or 3:30 and to take the girls home. And it made him very aware. What is it like to be a single parent? When personal lives intrude in the decision-making of the court, we see what I would argue are more humanistic decisions that make moral sense, not just legal sense.
Let us stipulate that there are cultural products that could be produced that would show us something genuine about the inner life of these justices as they go about their job. Would we be hurting the court if we humanized it, demystifying the mystery on which it bases so much of its power?
No, because the sunlight that exposes the workings of the court give us a deeper appreciation of what the justices are really looking at and the way it affects human beings. Yes, they're not beholden to anyone. They don't have to raise money for elections, but they still work for the people. And to think that to be walled off, to be separated emotionally, intellectually, physically, is what's necessary for them to be sufficiently detached. That doesn't serve their interest, and it certainly doesn't serve our interest.
Now, that's an argument for cameras in the courtroom and for greater openness. Is it an argument for more culture about the court?
Art, culture, is a very different portal of information, of knowledge. The world of the artist is a world that, at its core, deals with the emotional complexity of human beings. Journalists don't have that obligation. They can do it, but they don't have that obligation. That's entirely the obligation of the artist. One way to understand what human beings gain from seeing cultural depictions of the legal system, you can see right out of Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice. Portia, who plays the role of a judge, has her very famous quality of mercy speech. Mercy seasons justice. Think about the word seasoning, adding flavor, changing texture. And you can make the same argument about culture seasoning justice. When you season justice with art and culture, justice itself becomes more comprehensible, and it makes us much more willing to accept the outcome because we understand it in a way that we wouldn't have if it was justice alone.
Thane, thank you very much.
Thank you, Brooke. I enjoyed this immensely.
Thane Rosenbaum is a distinguished fellow at New York University's School of Law, where he directs the Forum on Law, Culture, and Society.
Hey, I heard that there was a Supreme Court justice on Sesame Street.
Hi, baby bear. I am Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor, but you can call me Justice.
Oh, well, you can call me Baby.
Okay, baby.
Okay, Justice.
For decades, one notable performance of the court's proceedings has been Nina Totenberg's so-called Dirty Reads on NPR. Audio of oral arguments is only released on Fridays, with rare exceptions, so Nina has become perhaps the most admired practitioner of the art of on-air Supreme Court oral interpretation. Here she reads from the transcript of a case last year about religious rights for inmates. specifically whether Muslim prisoners may wear half-inch beards in Arkansas prisons.
Justice Breyer, then do you think this might be what Congress was trying to prevent when it said that exaggerated fears often allowed prison officials to stop prisoners from exercising their religious rights? Answer, just because we haven't found the example doesn't mean they aren't there. Justice Alito, exasperated, then why can't the prison just give the inmate a comb and tell him to comb out his beard? And if there's a tiny revolver hidden in his half-inch beard, it will fall out.
The dirty read. You're not crazy about that term.
No, I'm not. I think I was guilty of the dirty read when I was young in radio. The dirty read suggests you're taking neutral terms, but with your inflection, you're making them sound nefarious. And I don't ever do that anymore. What I do, because I have no contemporaneous tape of the oral arguments, and I do cover them, is try my best to bring the listener into the courtroom through my voice, picking the pithiest parts of the argument, and as best as I can, acting them out as I heard them. And so that's not a dirty read, that's an accurate read.
Of course, the reason the dirty read even exists is because the justices forbid filming of any kind during oral arguments or on decision days. And some reporters even agree.
Because it's very loosey-goosey and brutal sometimes, rough and tumble up there. And if there were cameras, some people definitely would pull their punches and oral argument would not be what it is. But the most important thing, I think, is that if these 9 people had their faces on TV all the time, they would have to have an enormous security apparatus to protect them all the time that doesn't exist today. And they live in an ivory tower enough. It's good that I can see Elena Kagan squeezing a melon at the Safeway or the Whole Foods. It's good that some of these folks drive themselves. You know, when they go to a big event, they're driven, they're protected, but they lead normal lives. And if they didn't, that ivory tower would become farther up in the sky and even more remote, and I don't think that would be good for the country.
Slate's Dahlia Lithwick is sympathetic to the privacy argument, but still comes down on the side of increased transparency.
The arguments I have no patience for are the arguments that say that it's too complicated for lay people to understand, and if they saw it, they just get all confused and weird. When you have an institution that 90% of what it does is private, what it does in public needs to be seen by the public.
But she concedes the public won't be seeing them courtside anytime soon.
I think those of us who watch for signs that the justices are going to open up to more technology, they're going to allow more bloggers to be credentialed, they're going to allow cameras in there. We always think, let's look at the younger ones. Let's look at Justice Kagan and Sotomayor. Let's look at John Roberts. He has young kids. Maybe he's going to be open to it. And inexorably what happens is they say at their confirmation hearings, you know, I'm open to the possibility of cameras in there. I understand people need to see. And within 6 months on the bench, they're like, nope, never going to happen. So there it is. I think it's not about youth. It's about privacy.
We don't have to speculate. Many times over the years, the justices themselves have explained their views. So we thought we'd let them speak for themselves. Here are Justices Scalia, Kennedy, Kagan, Breyer, Sotomayor, Thomas, Ginsburg, and former Justice Souter on the issue of cameras in the court, in their own words, more or less.
Television in court. I was for it when I first joined the court and switched and remained on that side of it. I do not believe the purpose would be to educate the American people.
It will alter the way in which we hear our cases, the way in which we talk to counsel, the way in which we use that precious power. Please don't introduce into the dynamic the temptation, the insidious temptation to think that one of my colleagues is trying to get a soundbite for the television. We don't want that. Please, Senator, we don't want that. Please don't introduce the temptation, the insidious temptation.
Television in the court.
The way in which we use that precious hour.
Television in the court.
We'll have to talk together.
We don't want that.
Television in the court.
I think it would be a terrific thing.
Please don't introduce the insidious temptation. Trying to get a soundbite for the television.
Could you argue the opposite position?
I could make a lot of points about educating the public.
If the American people watched our proceeding gavel to gavel, they would never again ask, Judge Scalia, why do you have to be a lawyer to be on the Supreme Court?
When you see what happens, it's an inspiring sight. All 9 justices, so prepared, so smart, so thorough, really seeing government at work.
If 1 million people could have seen that oral argument, that would be wonderful.
I have had positive experiences with cameras.
It seems somewhat perverse to exclude the television.
I don't see any problem with having proceedings televised.
So it sounds like you all changed your minds.
The day you see a camera coming into our courtroom, it's going to roll over my dead body.
Regular appearances on TV would mean significant changes in the way my colleagues could conduct their lives. My anonymity is already gone.
Most of the American people would see 15-second takeouts, and those takeouts would not be characteristic of what we do. They would be uncharacteristic.
Yeah, now but what we see is an article in a newspaper that's out of context.
That's fine. People read that and they say, well, it's an article in a newspaper. But somehow when you see it live, an excerpt live, it has a much greater impact. Television in the court.
Over my dead body.
Good for the public.
Television in the court.
That would be wonderful.
We don't want that.
Television in the court.
My anonymity is already gone.
It means I'd have to get my hair done more often, Senator Specter.
Let me commend you on that last comment.
One last thing, and that is the credits. Will you read them?
Oh, yeah. I've got them. You want a genuinely dirty read, or do you want a clean read?
I want a genuinely dirty read.
It doesn't give me a lot to work with.
I'll say.
Okay. Okay. Mm-hmm. Bob, that's it for this week's show. On the Media is produced by Kimmy Regler, Mira Sharma, Alana Casanova-Burgess, and Jesse Brenneman. We had more help from Alex Friedland, Joel Werner, and Dasha Lissitsi. And our show was edited by Brooke. Our technical director is Jennifer Munson. Brooke. Katya Rogers is our executive producer. Jim Schachter is WNYC's vice president for news. Bassist composer Ben Allison wrote our theme. On the Media is a production of WNYC Studios. I'm Brooke Gladstone. Bob. And I'm Bob Garfield.
To hear the full hour we produced about the Supreme Court, which includes the Breaking News Consumer Handbook Supreme Court Edition, go to our website, onthemedia.org, and while you're there, sign up for our newsletter and be entered to win a hat crocheted by Brooke. We're giving away 3 of them, and by the way, if you're already a newsletter subscriber, you are already entered to win. Thanks for listening to this On the Media Podcast Extra. I'm Bob Garfield.